How's it going, crypto community? This is Jade Martian back with part 4 of the Chris Larson and Stephen Thomas talk at Google. So, real quick, if you are not familiar with me, why are you watching my part 4 of this series? Go back and watch the rest. But before you leave, be sure to hit that subscribe button even, right? Also, be sure if you enjoy this content to hit that like and ring that bell if you want to stay up to date for each part in this series and my other talks regarding all things XRP, right? So without any further ado, let's jump into this part 4, starting with Chris Larson.
But definitely, I think the world's never seen anything like this before. So it's trying to grapple, like, what are the metrics? What, is it you compare it to Visa? You compare it to gold? Is it the first protocol that can be monetized? Lots of new questions.
Awesome, guys. Really appreciate it. Stefan's now going to give an awesome presentation about what's in store on the technical side for Ripple. And then Chris is going to stay here. Stefan's going to come back, and we're going to do a little Q&A with the audience. So take it away.
Yeah. So what this is trying to illustrate is if you deploy Interledger on some network, and we envision that there will probably be sort of a global instance of it, just like the internet has a global instance, then you have these different nodes, these little blue nodes here, and we call them connectors, but they're basically like routers in IP. So they basically take in packets on one side, they look at the destination on the packet, they compare it to their routing table, and then they forward that packet towards that destination. Whenever you look at any kind of blockchain presentation, there's a pretty good chance you'll see some kind of graphic that has nodes connected by lines, some kind of graph. And you'll hear things like Bitcoin is the TCP/IP of money. And when we hear that, we cringe a little bit because if you know anything about how TCP/IP works and how Bitcoin works, they're very different protocols that do very different things in a very different way. And so the challenge that we always have when we talk about Interledger is it is actually a lot like TCP/IP. And through this little presentation, I want to try to convince you as to why I say that. But people already have usually seen some kind of blockchain presentation that already looks a lot like this, but is a little bit more superficial in terms of the similarities.
So, ultimately, what Chris Larson ended on was that nobody's ever seen anything quite like what we're seeing with blockchain before, especially with this new interledger technology and this decentralized network of value that seems to be emerging. And what we're now getting into is the meat and potatoes of how Interledger actually operates. So hopefully many of you out there can take this as sort of a crash course in a topic that we're going to start talking a lot about in the next coming weeks, months. I've been avoiding it because I've been trying to also mainly use my channel for the start to help educate newer investors, but as this goes on, I'm obviously going to have to start getting into a lot more complex topics that are ongoing in this arena, right? So, without further ado, let's hop right back into it.
And so if I want to send a packet into this network, I just send it to whichever connector I'm connected to, and it should find its way to whatever receiver I've put on it. So in that way, it's a lot like TCP/IP. Now you might say, okay, so you're routing these packets, but how does actual money really move? So the way that works is that once you have sort of a path and you're sending these packets, each link is responsible for its own settlement. So what we tend to do is if you have two connectors that have a peering relationship with each other, they're going to have this packet traffic going back and forth. And so they're going to look at those packets, and then they're going to eventually settle. And for the core of the network, it makes the most sense to settle through a digital asset. And the reason for that is that they are very easy to move internationally across borders. You have very low costs in terms of when you move them. And since you're going to have a lot of inbound and outbound traffic, it makes sense to just stay in that digital asset to do all of your settlements. But of course, the majority of people, users out there, don't actually have easy access to digital assets yet. And so you do need some form of support for traditional payment systems. And the interesting thing is that all these settlement networks really do is move payments across, or move money. And so that's something that is supported by all the legacy payment networks. So what we can actually do is we can just aggregate to a greater degree. So we wait a little bit longer before we settle. And then we send one big payment across. So you see that kind of at the beginning here with the sender down there, and the receiver in the upper right, where those settlements are happening a little less frequently, and they're a little bit bigger, and they're probably a little bit more expensive, but they can settle lots and lots of these individual packets.
So the idea ultimately, to simplify what he said thus far, is that this represents Alice and Bob. Alice at the bottom, Bob at the top, right? So Alice wants to send $1 million to Bob. Well, to send $1 million to Bob, Bob doesn't want $1 million. He wants $1 million in whatever the equivalent is in British pounds. So if they just do it through regular banking, that could take several days, and it could cost thousands of dollars on that $1 million. So why not instead send it through this ILP system that finds whatever currencies it can move that funds through the most rapidly to get it between Alice to Bob. And through the ILP, because of how hyper efficient it and its native asset XRP is, it can get millions of dollars from Alice to Bob instead, and Bob gets his pounds with Alice putting dollars in. Instead of costing thousands of dollars, it costs literally less than a penny to send $1 million through RippleNet, right? That's why this is such a powerful piece of technology. Now we got a little bit more to go before I want to end this one, so let's keep going.
So with this architecture, what that means is that from an end-to-end perspective, we can send a packet at incredibly low latency. We can send it at an incredibly low incremental cost. And so that's really what makes it feel a lot like the internet. You can really just connect to lots of different services and pay for lots of different things without accumulating a lot of fees while doing that. And then sure, there's a settlement eventually, and hopefully these last mile sort of settlements will get more efficient, just like internet connectivity went from 56K modems all the way up to what we have now, where I have Google Fiber, so I'm very happy with that. So yeah, here's a little chart of like the actual architecture. And again, if you're familiar with TCP/IP, they draw the same kind of picture with the 4 layers, which is sometimes called the internet architecture. It's a little bit less detailed than the OSI architecture, but I won't bore you with that. It's just a reference for the people that know that. So the 4 layers actually work a lot similar to very similarly to the 4 layers in TCP/IP. So I just want to go through those 4 and kind of to give you a sense of how this all works together. The way you should think about the interledger layer is that's essentially an abstraction layer. So that's basically the thing that you have all the different ways of moving money below it, and then you have all the different use cases for moving money above it, and it kind of brings them all together. So in the case of the internet, it would be the internet layer has all the different ways of moving information below it and all the different use cases building on top of it. And so now you can have all these different combinations. I can make a Skype call over my Wi-Fi. I can make send an email over my satellite internet. So it really doesn't matter what use case I'm using and which network I'm on. I can combine them in different ways. And so this is kind of doing the same thing for money. Okay. Now, on the application layer, this would be sort of the equivalent of like HTTP, SMTP. This is use case specific. You would make different application layer protocols for different use cases. So one that we've designed so far is called SPSP, or Simple Payment Setup Protocol. And basically all that does is it defines what an internet sort of identifier looks like. So think of that like an email address. And you could send to that type of identifier if you wanted to pay somebody as on a peer-to-peer basis, or you could build that into simple apps. It's not super efficient, so it's kind of like HTTP. It's sort of a general purpose application layer protocol. You could make a much more specialized one. So for instance, we did an experiment where we built payments into WebTorrent, so basically to pay the uploaders, but also the content creators, which I think is a really cool aspect of this. It's like it's efficient enough that you can pay a lot of different parties in the flow of whatever app or interaction that you're part of. And we'll see a demo of that in a bit. But I think this is where I expect a lot of variety is on the application layer. Now, we'll talk about the transport layer. So if you're familiar with TCP/IP, this is where you find your TCP. And TCP is really common to a lot of different application layer protocols that build on it. And it gives you some sort of basic services, right? It gives you sequencing of packets so that your data comes out the right order. It gives you retransmission. If a packet gets lost, it'll send it again, and so on. And we have a transport layer protocol called PSK2, and it does a lot of the same things. It's responsible for doing things like if you send a large payment, it'll split it into smaller chunks and then reassemble them. It'll do things like retransmission of payment packets, etc. So again, like I'm trying to really get across, like we're copying from the internet a lot, and we have to give them a lot of credit, because a lot of the things that they do actually apply to money very well. Now, the interledger layer is kind of an interesting one because that's where all the routing happens. And when we first started out, I'll tell you one anecdote about the design of this layer, which is when we first started out, we assumed that the routing would have to be quite different because we're talking about money after all. We're not talking about information. And so we knew about BGP and how it works and so on, but we thought a lot of those things wouldn't be applicable. We wanted to route by the lowest cost path. We thought that that was the most important thing, was to minimize the fees. But as we're actually building it, we realized that if you optimize by fees, what can happen is somebody in the network just advertises an absurd rate. So they just advertise, hey, I can exchange $1 for 600 euros. Now that's suddenly the best path to take for absolutely every payment in the entire network. Now what do you think is going to happen? So that node's going to go down. Obviously that rate was never real to begin with. And so the whole thing just breaks down. And so one of the reasons for the way that BGP is designed is to make the length of the path one of the primary metrics. And what that does is if someone advertises some ridiculous metrics, you're still only going to take down his immediate neighborhood, because for everyone else it's still going to look like a big detour, a very long path that they don't want to take. And so it turns out that even for money, the length of the path is actually a very good proxy for all the other things you might be interested in, like how reliable is it, what's the latency, what's the fees. Those are all lower or tend to be lower for shorter paths.
So I'm going to end this video at that point. Basically, the idea is that the 4 layers of the interledger system is your top layer, which is your applications, which is your Flappy Bird, your whatever app that's going to connect you to the digital assets below it, the liquidity supply that will perhaps allow you to make money off of playing those games and giving your attention to that provider or that service provider. Maybe you instead pay that content creator per hour or whatever for playing that game. Who knows how that system works out in that way, but that's the application layer. You move on to your transportation layer, and that's really the scalability layer of the interledger system, which is what is basically meant to help facilitate communication between the interledger protocol and the app layer, right? So then you go to your interledger system, and what is that? That is the communication layer for the digital asset blockchains beneath it, that it then finds which one is going to provide the fastest, cheapest, most efficient liquidity source for to perform the transaction that needs to be done, right? So that is the breakdown of Stefan's closing remarks there, and going to be my closing remarks for this video because it's already probably a little bit too long, but that's okay. Keep the best for last, right? And as always, thank you for being one of the last to be tuning in. If you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button, and also be sure to hit that like since you clearly enjoyed this content. Also, ring that bell so you can stay up to date on all the XRP related content that I'm putting out. Thank you all for tuning in. As always, I've been Jade Martian. You've been watching the Martian Report, and I can't wait to see all you, my XRP Martians, in my next video on Mars.